Welcome everyone back to the sixth session of the Book of Deuteronomy, Telling and Retelling, where we've had the pleasure of learning with Rabbi Silber for these past few weeks. In this class, we will be following Rabbi Silber as he delves into Deuteronomy, a new version of an old story. Sources for this class will be coming from the Book of Deuteronomy. If you are able to follow along in your own Tanakh, you are certainly welcome to do so, but sources will be posted on screen from Sefaria. And with that, I'm going to hand over things to him.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to begin today with Moshe's appeal to God to be able to enter the land for Et Hanan, second parsha in Sefer Devarim. Previous to that, the Torah talks of the battles, successful battles against Sichon and Og, and the capture of their land. Previously, we were told that Israel was enjoined from starting up with fighting with Edom, with Ammon and Moab. They didn't want to cross through the land, and they were not able to do so. But when it came to Sichon and Og, then God says to Moshe, begin to conquer the land. And we talked about the difference between the description in Dvarim and the description, presumably, what it sounds like in the book of Bamidbar. Talked about the story of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. The point being that in Sefer Devarim, it sounds like that this is all part of the plan, that the land of Sichon and Og that's captured is actually the beginning of the conquest. And that was that the idea was the conquest should begin on the other side of the Jordan. Whereas in the book of Bamidbar, it sounds like the war against Sichon and Og happened just because Israel was trying to get across, and Sichon came out to attack them. Israel defeats Sichon and takes part of the land. That's what would appear to be the case in the book of Bamidbar, although one can raise some issues about that as well. In any event, I mentioned all that in as a preparation for what we're about to look at, which is chapter 3 of Sefer Devarim, verse number 23, for Et Hanan, the second parsha, and it begins this way: for Et Hanan el Hashem, bo'etahi leimar. Says Moshe for Et Hanan. So for Et Hanan means Tchina is some kind of a prayer. There are many different words for prayer, a petition, a prayer. And Moshe says, for Et Hanan el Hashem, bo'etahi leimar. Sometimes that form, for Et Hanan, is a kind of intensive. I pleaded with God, I prayed to God at that time. Now, what does it mean at that time? So what it may mean at that time, and I actually saw that this Tamir Granot has a gigantic book on Sefer Devarim, about 900 pages long. He makes this point. And the point is that at this time means, given the fact that that they've begun to conquer the land. So Moshe has been involved in that. Moshe has been involved in the defeat of Sichon, the defeat of Og. So Moshe says to God, now listen, I've already begun. I'm part of the conquest. I led the charge to conquer this part of the promised land. Let me continue. That's bo'etahi, at this time. And Moshe pleads with God. Adonai Elohim, atah hachilota laharot et avdecha et gadcha v'et yodcha chazaka asher miel b'shamayim u'va'aretz asher yaseh k'maasecha v'chigvurotecha. You've begun. I've seen the beginning, the first works of your greatness, mighty hand, etc. So in the next verse, Ebru ana v'yareh oretz hatova asher b'yever hayardein ahara tova zeh v'havonon. Let me cross over. Let me cross over to the other side and see the good land on the other side of the Jordan, the good hill country, the Lebanon, etc. Let me cross. Moshe has a request, a personal request. Most of Moshe's prayers are not personal. Moshe is the great spokesperson for the Jewish people. Moshe pleads with God at the golden calf. Moshe pleads with God with the story of the Meraglim. And here Moshe pleads for himself, let Hanan, And that's his request. And God's response, we know, is in the very next verse. Moshe tells us about God's response. Vayitaber Hashem bilu manchem v'lo shamai elai. Vayitaber plays on the word la'avor. It's a play on the word, but evra means anger. So God was angry at me. Vayitaber Hashem bilu manchem. We'll get to what manchem means. Let's say because of you. Because of you, says Moshe, and he said this earlier. God said, I can't cross over. V'lo shamai elai. God did not hear me in the sense God did not accept my prayer. Vayomer Hashem elai ravlach. God said to me, enough, ravlach. Al tosef daber elai od badavar hazeh. Speak no more about this matter. It's final. You're not crossing over. That's God's response. And God continues to speak, and I'll get to the continuation in a couple of minutes. But I want to focus on this request of Moshe over here. And the first thing I notice is that Moshe's praise to God in the very second pasuk says Hashem Elokim, Aleph Dawud Nun Yud, and then Yud Hey Vav Hey. And that is an extremely unusual formulation of God's name. The prominent place where this appears, where that formulation appears, is actually way back in Sefer Bereshit. I just read it to you. When God makes the covenant with Abraham, the Brit Ben Abitarim. And God said to Abraham in chapter 15 of Bereshit, Abraham had said, God said to Abraham, don't be afraid, your reward is great. Scharcha arbei miyot. The beginning of chapter 15, we visited that text many times. Vayomer Abraham, Adonai Elohim, matiten li. Avram appeals to God with this name of God, Hashem Elokim, very unusual. Aleph Dawud Nun Yud, and then Yud Hey Vav Hey. What are you going to give me? I have no successor. And Eliezer of Damascus is going to inherit me, says Abraham. I have no one to carry out the covenant. But God says to Abraham, no, that's not the case. Walk outside, count the stars. A great nation will emerge from you. And then God and Avram believed. Ve'amin b'Hashem, Avram had faith. And then God speaks to Abraham. Vayomer elav, ani Hashem asher hotzeticha me'ur kasdim. I'm the God who took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land. It's a promise of the land. So you'll have heirs. You have successors, and you will have the land. Vayomar, and Avram says, Adonai Elohim, b'mo edah ki roshena. Again, he uses that unusual name of God. Aleph Dawud Nun Yud, Yud Hey Vav Hey. And we have it over here as well. When Moshe prays for Etchanan, with the main prayer Moshe makes for himself. Please, one thing, let me cross over to the other side. The response is, no, you can't do that. But it's interesting to note this particular name, Adonai Elohim. What is that? So it's interesting to note that this name of God, this particular name of God, figures prominently in one other place in the Bible. One other place in the Bible. So I want to take a little detour because I think it's actually very instructive where it appears. It appears in the second book of Samuel, Shmuel Bet, chapter 7. Shmuel Bet, chapter 7, famous chapter. In the beginning of that chapter, David, who's the king over Israel, he has his capital city, he's captured Jerusalem. He's now really the king, and he turns to his friend, Nathan the prophet, Natan HaNavi, and he says to Natan, look, he says, I have a fancy house. I live in a house of cedars. And God dwells behind the curtains. The Mishkan is curtains. Is that right? David is saying, that doesn't seem right to me. I have a beautiful house of cedar wood, and God is dwelling in a curtain, And Natan says to David, do whatever you want. God is with you. And then, of course, that night, God speaks to the prophet. God says to the prophet, go back to David and say to him, you're going to build me a house. You're going to build me a house. Then God goes on to say, I didn't ask for a house. If I wanted a house, I'd have a house. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build you a house in the sense of dynasty. I'm going to build your dynasty. Your son will build me a house, not you, but your son will build me a house. That is the gist of God's speech to David. He calls David Avdi. Say this to my servant David, Avdi David. Now, that's God's statement. So Nathan relays God's speech to David. If we take a look in chapter 7, beginning in verse number 18, let's say, verse 18. Now we have David's response. It's one of the great moments in the book as far as David is concerned, his response. He's just been told you can't do it. God does not give a reason why David can't build a house. God just says, you're not going to do it. Your son is going to do it. And what we study in the book of Shmuel, we would actually investigate this very deeply. Why can't David build the house? I want to say one thing about it, but let me just read part of David's response. It says, Vayavo HaMelech David, Vayeshev Uznei Hashem. Vayomer, Mi Anochi Hashem Elokim, Aleph Daled Nun Yud Yud Hey Vav Hey. Umi Beiti, Ki Aviotani Ad Halom. Vatiktan Od Zot Yenecha, Hashem Elokim, Aleph Daled Nun Yud Yud Hey Vav Hey. Vatadaber Gam Beit Avdecha Lamei Rachok. V'zot Torat Ha'adam Ad Hashem Elokim. Third time. Umay Yosif David Od Daber Elecha. V'ato Yodat Et Avdecha Ad Hashem Elokim. Fourth time. 4 times. It appears almost no place else. Again in verse 23. I came Godalta Ad Hashem Elokim. A 5th time. So 5 times. It may be more. I didn't check out. If there are more, I suspect there might be a couple more. In any event, yes, it's again in verse number 28. We have it again. That's 6. I believe there's 7. Unusual. Appears almost no place else. But it appears in 2 places. It appears in the story of when Abraham, the covenant with Abraham. Abraham refers to God as Ad Hashem Elokim. And it appears with Moshe's request in our story. Moshe pleads with God to be able to cross over to the other side. So it struck me that actually the book of Shmuel is actually recalling both of those. It's recalling both of those. Yes, the 7th guest says, Debbie says in verse 29 is the 7th time. I figured it was 7. It is 7 times Ad Hashem Elokim. All right. What is David's response? King David, what is David's response? David's response, as far as our text is concerned, he says something interesting. Umayosif David od l'daber elecha, v'ato yodato et avdecha Hashem Elokim. Verse number 20. Why should I even continue to talk? David says to God, you know your servant. David calls himself God's servant. And I think the point is, Umayosif od David l'daber, right? Recalls what God said to Moshe in our story. Ravlach, God said to Moshe in verse number 26, yes. Al tosef daber elai od badavar hazeh. Don't speak anymore. So it actually recalls that. And the 2 stories, if you think about it, have something in common. Namely, the point of God's response to David, which is interesting on many reasons, but fundamentally, the point is this. God says to David, I made you the king. I took you from the sheepfold. I made you the king. And David's in complete control. That's how the chapter begins. No more enemies. And but you can't do everything. You can't do everything. Every human being is limited, and therefore you can't also build it. You can't also build the temple. Someone else has to do that. It's going to be your son, because I'm going to build your house for you. I don't need you to build my house, says God, but I'm going to build you a house. But there's a limit what people can do. And actually, that seems to be the point of our story with Moshe as well. What God says to Moshe is, Ravlach, enough. Sufficient. Sufficient in the sense you had a task. Your task was to take the people out of Egypt and to present them with the vision for the future. That's your task. You won't necessarily be there when the mission has been fulfilled, that is the conquest of the land, but you can set it up. You can actually set it up. If you think about this, it's actually the story of the covenant with Abraham as well. Because the covenant with Abraham, God says to Abraham, when Abraham asked God, what is our responsibility? You made a covenant, what do we have to do? Then God responds, says, take three animals, 3 sets of animals and 2 birds. And God says to Abraham, you should know there'll be 3 generations of suffering, represented by the animals that are cut in pieces. And the 4th generation that flies to freedom are the birds that are not cut. But the point of the covenant is it's in 2 stages. The people that suffer, that is to say, the people that set it up, are not the ones who actually possess the land. The 4th generation possesses the land, which is the story of our story, the Chumash. There are 3 generations of suffering in Egypt, and the 4th generation, the generation that Moshe speaks to in the book of Devarim, they're going to possess the land. No one does everything. And that's the Adoshem Elokim. For whatever reason, I have to think more about why this particular name of God, this conjunction of these 2 names, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, is found in these 3 places. But the message fundamentally is the same message. Of course, in the book of Shmuel plays with these texts in very interesting ways. One of the interesting ways, I just mentioned this before we continue, is that in the story of David, God says to the prophet, go back to Avdi David. Go back to my servant David. And David calls himself Eved Hashem over and over again in David's response. And the question is, what is the significance of being an Eved Hashem? The truth is, Eved Hashem is perhaps the highest accolade one can achieve. Moshe is called Eved Hashem. The end of Sefer Dvarim, Moshe, the servant of God, dies. That is a high accolade. But in the story of David, actually, I think there's actually something else to it in the hands of the book of Shmuel, that Avdi David has another meaning. And that is that David had said in chapter 7, says to the prophet, listen, I have a fancy house, I have a house of cedars, and God has a tent. That is to say, what David is saying is, I'm going to build God a house. I have a house. Shouldn't God have a house as well? And God's response is, go back to my servant David. That is to say, there's actually some kind of critique here as well. There's no mutuality, God says to David. I have a house, God should have a house. You're thinking incorrectly. There's no relevance. The 2 of us are not on the same level. So go back and remind my servant David that he's my Eved. He's not my peer. He's my Eved. And David accepts it. But that's one of the great moments where David says, you're so right. And there's a very interesting verse in David's acceptance of it. David says, I'm so grateful. I'll summarize what David says. I'm so grateful for what you've done to me. And I'm also grateful that you made promises about the future. I'm so grateful. Torah Adam Hashem Elokim. Very, very strange verse. And this is Torah Adam. What does it mean? So Torah Adam Hashem Elokim is a very good question. And I was thinking that Torah Adam, this is the human condition. The human condition is we can't do everything. We're all limited. But on the other hand, you made a promise about the future, and that promise is so significant. So Torah, most we can hope for is we do whatever we do in our lifetime, and we hope that the things we care about will continue into the future. More than that, we can't do. And that's true of the covenant. That's true, and that's true of Moshe. So these three stories actually are linked together, and the link is, the link is there. You have this very unusual name of God that's found in these three places. Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Coming back to Moshe, then, one way to understand what God says to Moshe is precisely what I just said, through the lens of Shmuel, namely, you can't have it all. You've done your mission. And interesting is, going back to our text in Sefer Devarim, God says to Moshe, Vayomer Hashem Eli, in verse number 26, Ravlach, you have enough, sufficient, enough. Al Tosif Daber Eli, don't speak about this matter anymore. Save your breath. Ravlach. And the words Ravlach actually are found elsewhere in the Torah. Do you remember where we have the expression Ravlach?
Korach.
But we have
Korach, yes, with the rebellion, the Dasan Abiram and Korach. Ravlachem b'nei Levi. Moshe,
Rabbi Silber?
You want Aaron's job, you want my job, you have enough. Ravlachem, it's sufficient. Don't try to take more than you're entitled to. You're entitled to this and be satisfied with what you have. Ravlach. That's what God seems to be saying to Moshe. It's very striking, actually, in a way, because on other occasions, Moshe confronts God in a very powerful way, and God does not say to Moshe enough. The other way around, God says to Moshe, the golden calf, if you leave me alone, I'll destroy them. So Moshe understands what God is really saying. Don't leave me alone. Moshe goes on and on. His prayers are responded to. When it comes to Moshe's personal prayer himself, the answer is you can't cross over. But, and the but is very important. But is Alei Rosh HaPisgah, go to the top of the mountain, and Sa'enecha, raise up your eyes, Yamav v'tzafona, Teimana u'mizracha, to the west, to the north, to the south, and to the east, Urei beinecha, and see. Ki lo tavor et hayarden hazeh, you will not cross the Jordan. So God says two things to Moshe, two different things. One is you can't cross. It's actually interesting, by the way, you can't cross, given what we've studied, the context of what we've studied, you can't cross is essentially what the various nations said to Israel earlier in the chapter, right? Israel said, I want to cross through your land. And Edom says you can't cross through. They don't give permission to cross through. So in a sense, Moshe's in the same situation. He wants to cross over. And the answer is you can't cross over. And the but is very important. You can cross over, but you can see it. And the point of seeing it is very, very significant. And this comes up later in the Chumash as well. Seeing it is very significant. You can actually see what you've been preparing for. And depending on which text that you read in the Chumash, there's a different focus. Sometimes the focus is on you can't enter. And sometimes the focus is you can't enter. Okay, but you can see. And over here, it's a question how to read this. Is it fundamentally a negative? You can't cross? Or it's a negative, but there's a positive side as well. You can't cross yourself, but number one, you can see it. And number two, command Yoshua, strengthen him, Kihu Yavar, he will cross. He will enable them to inherit the land. So over here, it strikes me that there's more of a negative tinge to it. Moshe really wants to go, and God says, Moshe reports. God said, no, on your account. We'll get to that later. Yeah, but you can see, and your pupil, Joshua, who's Moshe's protege, Moshe's disciple, he will cross over. That's what you have over here in chapter 3. If you look, for example, at the very end of this book, the end of Zot HaBracha, which records the death of Moshe, there I think you get a different sense, actually. It's chapter 34, the very last chapter of the book. It says Moshe went up to the top. Moshe goes up to Mount Nebo, and God shows him. Vayarehu Hashem, God shows him all of the land. And then the Torah tells us in some detail what Moshe sees. The Gilad until dawn, Naphtali, the land of Ephraim, the land of Menashe, the land of Judah, until Adayom Acharon, as far as the western sea. And then the Negev, the south, Kikar, Begat Yirecho, Irat Rimat Tzoar. He sees Jericho up to Tzoar. Vayomer Hashem Elov, Zot Haaretz, Hashem Nishbati Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov Le'mor Zarachat Nena. Erisicho B'Einecha, V'Shamar Lo Tavar. There, the emphasis, I think, unlike our chapter, which is not clear to me what the focus is, but the focus in chapter 34 is true. You can't enter, but look what you can see. And the Torah has made much more detail about what Moshe is seeing. This is not, it's not the same kind of, and there's no mention of sin over here, by the way. There's no mention of sin of any type. Moshe lives to 120 years. He lives a full life. As David says, "O Torata Adam." It's a full, it's human limitation. But he accomplishes so much. And he's actually able to see his dreams. That's the focus at the end of the book, what the book wants to end on a more upbeat note. And not just that, Yoshua takes over. And if you look at the end of the book, it says, Yoshua bin Nun molei ruach chachma, in verse number 9, right at the very end of the book. Yoshua bin Nun was filled with wisdom, ki samach Moshe et yodav alav. Vayishmeu elov b'nei Yisrael vayasu kashem tzivah Hashem et Moshe. So Joshua was trained by Moshe. Moshe, his wisdom, right? He's filled with wisdom, for Moses had placed his hands upon him. He's a continuation of Moses, and not only that, and all of Israel listened to him and did, as God commanded. You expect Yoshua? No, as God commanded Moshe. So Moshe lives on through his pupil, through his disciple, and the teachings of Moshe live on through the disciple. That's the way the book ends. So the book ends on a very positive note. Of course, he's human, but a full life, 120 years, which is the Torah says towards the beginning of the Chumash, the years of the human can be not more than 120. It's a full life. His teachings are carried forth, and not just that, he sees the land that was the promised land of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So coming back to our text now, here is a little bit different, I think. Here, there's more of a focus on you can't, especially when you think about the parallel between Israel trying to cross through the nations and being told you can't cross through, and Moshe trying to cross over. La'avor, but vayitaber Hashem b'yumanchem, on account of you, says Moshe, I was not allowed to cross over. Let me just stop here for a moment to take any comments or questions. And then I want to say one other thing about L'manchem as we continue our journey here.
I see Susan Lieberman, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yes, Susan, go ahead.
Do you mind?
Yeah, isn't Hashem Elokim first introduced in the Torah itself in Bereshis?
It's different over there, though.
But
yeah, Hashem Elokim is there, but not Aleph Dalet Nun Yud Yud Vav Hey. That formulation. Hashem Elokim is found in the second creation story 20 times.
Right.
That's one of the most unusual, but it's not the same formulation. You see, right? We read it as Hashem Elokim, but the point is it's Yud Vav Hey actually. It's read Elokim, but in the second creation narrative, it's Yud Vav Hey and then the word Elohim. That's different. That appears many times. But Aleph Dalud Nun Yud Yud Hey Vav Hey. That's all. I think it's one other place, and it appears 7 times in the David story. So it's something which is. By the way, since you mentioned Hashem Elokim, I just wanted to point out that the connection to the Abraham to the covenant is not just with the word Hashem Elokim, but actually, when God speaks to David in chapter 7, and then David responds, there's another. Let me just find that verse. It's very striking. Links us. By the way, the David Abraham connections in the book of Shmuel run through the whole book. I mean, there are all kinds of connections of David and Abraham. Let me find this. 1 second. Yes. This is the message that God tells Natan to tell David. It says, listen, I've been with you throughout. I took you from the sheepfold. Which is also, there's a critique there as well. You think, I have a house, shouldn't God have a house? Listen, mister, you're a nobody, as far as I'm concerned. I took you from the sheepfold. I did everything, you did nothing for me. I did everything for you. What did I do for you? I took you from the sheepfold. I destroyed your enemies. I gave you a great renown, a great name. I gave you a shem gadol. Where's that expression playing off? Of course, Agadu Hashemecha. It's what God said to Abraham. The very first thing God says to Abraham, Agadu Hashemecha. So typically these texts, when they connect, it's not just one word. There are many, many other connections of David and Abraham in the book of Shmuel. In any event, so that's but Hashem Elokim is in the second creation narrative is 20 times. That's a different formulation of it. That's different. Okay. Yes, Beverly, you have the question. What is Beverly's question there?
Beverly's question, quote, I wanted to read my question of last week, other places of detailed retelling.
Oh, yes. Okay, so the Bible is replete with detailed, the book of Dvarim has all kinds of retellings. The Bible is replete with retellings, and sometimes the retellings, it's not just, I'll give you an example, but there are many, many, many examples. Let's say the following. The story David and Bathsheba, a famous story. David sends a message to Yoav to kill Uriah Hittite. David says, take him to the battlefield and suddenly withdraw from him, and he will be killed. That's what David says Yoav to do. Then what Yoav seems to do is something different. It doesn't do it. It does something different. Then Yoav speaks to the messenger to tell David. He tells him something else. Third thing, totally different. Then the messenger speaks to David. He also changes it. It's typical, by the way. You have four different descriptions of what's supposed to happen to Uriah, and they're all different. One is David speaking to Yoav, then Yoav does, and Yoav speaks to the messenger what to tell David, and then the messenger says something else. And the Bible is actually replete with this. There are many, many examples of this. The point is, of course, in each case, I think the point is to try to understand where this is coming from. Why does Yoav do differently? What's the message that Yoav gives the messenger? What is that about? Is it a defense of what he does? Is it also a critique of David? Why does the messenger change it? Maybe because what Yoav says to him makes no sense to him. It makes sense to David, but not to him, etc. And I think that when you're reading biblical narrative, one of the most central features of biblical narrative is the fact that stories are connected to each other, and you read one story in light of the other. This past week, we read the story of Isaac in the land of the Philistines. He says his wife is his sister. Abraham did it twice. And the point is that what the Chumash is saying is it's an invitation you can't, when you study the last story, let's say the third story, and you look at the first two stories, and suddenly you realize things about the first two stories that you didn't realize until you read the third parallel story. And suddenly you begin to think about all three stories, how they relate to each other, and they're all different. It's not that the story, it's not about repetition, because they're never exactly the same. And then you sort of go back to the first story. Now you read it differently. You see a critique of Abraham that maybe you didn't see earlier, etc. So this is something which is in this approach, what we study here, we study with me in any event, it's basic. I mean, this is the most basic thing, the parallels. And there's something else about the parallels, by the way. I was just reading a little article, it was written many years ago, about different approaches to the study of Bible. And one of the points of the parallels, I think is actually a very important point, is that what the parallels point to is that the Torah is some kind of unitary work. That is to say, there may be many sources for the Chumash. That's another question. We know there are ancient texts of the ancient Near East that have all kinds of parallels to the Torah, and they're much earlier than the Torah, that we know. But the question is, to what degree is the Torah to be read as one unitary work? It could be many sources, but at the end of the day, it's one work, as opposed to what documentary hypothesis says. It's a bunch of different stories that don't necessarily have connections one to the other. And the fact that you have all these patterns actually suggests very strongly this is a unitary work to be read as one book, not to be chopped up, and that one story plays off the other. And it's not simply that they were just including these stock stories in different places, because they're never exactly the same. And therefore, they're to be read. So I think that the patterns are important for this other reason. It's a different approach. The approach we have here is fundamentally, it's one book. And therefore, that both entitles us, and I think in a sense directs us to read it as one, to read one story in light of the other. And you begin with the language. You begin with the words, and you have stories that have parallel language. What the Tanakh is saying, the Torah in this case, but in general, is that one story plays off the other. They have to be read together, and there are also I would say foundational stories, like the Garden of Eden, like a Kedat Yitzchak, like Jacob wrestling with the angel. Certain foundational stories that the biblical texts keep going back to, and with a different focus, with a different slant, etc., with a different interpretation. There's all kinds of inner biblical interpretation that this approach allows one to see, which is why I think this is a very good way to read the Chumash. I'm not saying there weren't sources. Shakespeare had his sources also. But when you're studying Hamlet, you're studying Hamlet. You're not breaking it down into 5 different documents. It's one work. He had histories, he had who knows what else. But the fact is, so that's this great significance of seeing these parallels. That's a short answer. But it's a very basic question. Okay, let me just say one other thing. Yes, speak up. Yeah, Aviva,
Oh,
is it?
me?
Yeah.
Aviva, yes. Something that strikes me about this section with Moshe is the wisdom of it. Aside from the relationship between Moshe and God, that it's a different kind of leader to get to the promised land, metaphorically, whatever the promised land is, and the leader to rule it. And two examples from history strike me. Václav Havel, who was an amazing leader to liberate Czechoslovakia, but he was not a great president. And if God had said to him, you can't become president, it would have been better. And conversely, George Washington knew when to step down. So I'm just thinking of how this is wisdom for the ages.
Right. I think that actually it ties into what I was going to say about the word li'manchem. Li'manchem can mean because of you. In other words, Moshe's complaining. Moshe says, listen, because of your sin, I got caught up with your sin. By the way, the sin that is mentioned earlier in this book is the sin of the spies. The hitting the rock business is not mentioned, actually. It's mentioned later, but it's not mentioned here. When you read Sefer Devarim, you get a sense the generation of the first generation that left Egypt were condemned to stay in the desert, and Moshe stays with his people. But L'manchem can have that other significance that you're suggesting, which is Moshe is not the right guy for that job. The job of conquering the land is mostly a military. It's a big military component, and we know from the Torah that Yoshua was the commander-in-chief of the army. He fights Amalek. Moshe goes to the top of the mountain. Yoshua fights. So when you have the situation calls for a different kind of person. And when we study the book of Bamidbar, what I pointed out is that when Moshe says to God, you have to choose somebody. Moshe is told in chapter 27 that he's going to die and he's not going to enter the land. And Moshe turns to God and says, God, who knows the spirit of all, should choose somebody to lead, and that the congregation of Israel should not be like sheep who have no shepherd. And what I emphasized at that time was Moshe's conception of the leader is a shepherd. Moshe was a shepherd. We need a shepherd. And Joshua, he doesn't ask for Joshua. Joshua is not a shepherd. Joshua is a military man. Moshe doesn't want a military man. Moshe wants a shepherd. And at that time, we discussed at length about he's not just a military man at his job. He thinks like a military guy. That's Yoshua. And what God says to Moshe is, you're not wrong. He is a military man, but you can train him to be somewhat of a shepherd as well. I think we'll get to this later on, but it really fits in with what you're saying. It's a different job. Your job was you have the vision. You took them out of Egypt, but the next stage, which is the war and the conquest, that's not for you. And I would also add, you can't even cross over, as some of the Mefarshim point out. If you cross over, he can't do his job, because as long as you're around, nobody can succeed you, because who can succeed Moshe Rabbeinu? You know what I mean? So the point is that Adkan Ravlach, you were chosen for a task. You did it. You did it. Thank you very much. And now we move on with somebody else. So that's, I think L'manchem can be read that way as well. Okay. Now let us proceed. Okay. Now with the last verse of chapter 3, Vaneshev Bagai Mul Beit Pa'ar, we stayed on in the valley near Beit Pa'ar. Now that is a very interesting little verse, and that recalls the story of Baal Pa'ar. The story of Baal Pa'ar, we remember, was a story where Israel got involved with the Moabite women and the Midianite women, and they ended up worshiping at the idol, the idolatry of Baal Pa'ar. So they're in now. The Torah says, at this point, Israel stayed on in the valley near Baal Pa'ar. And now we begin chapter 4, which is different than the first 3 chapters, but in a way it's preparatory to the bulk of this book, which begins in chapter 5. So let's start with chapter 4. V'yata Yisrael shema lachukim ve'lamishpatim asher Elohim melamed etchem lasot v'man tichyu botem v'yirishtem et haaretz asher Hashem Elohei avotechem notenu lachem. This is how it starts. Moshe says, I'm going to teach you chukim u'mishpatim, laws, statutes, etc. Chukim u'mishpatim, the purpose of which is to enable you to dwell in the land, to inherit the land, which the God of your ancestors, the promised land. Promise was made to your ancestors, and you can live there provided that you follow these rules and statutes. Then Moshe says next, Lo tosifo hadavar asher Elohim mitzaveh etchem lo tigra'u mimenu. Do not add and do not subtract. L'shmar et mitzvat Hashem Elohechem asher Elohim mitzaveh etchem, and to obey the commandments the commandments of God that I command you today. Einechem harot Et asher asa Hashem b'Baal Pa'ar. You recall, says Moshe to them, what happened at Baal Pa'ar. Ki kol ha'ish asher alach acharei Baal Pa'ar, ishmido Hashem Elohecha mikirbecha. All those who followed Baal Pa'ar, God destroyed. V'atem adveikim Hashem Elohechem chayim kulchem hayom. But you that cleave unto God, you are all alive today. So let's stop here for a moment and just to reflect on these four verses at the beginning of chapter 4. First of all, just to make a note of the second pasuk, Lo tosifu hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem, lo tigra'u mimeno. The question is, what does that mean? This is a question that preoccupied the interpreters of the Talmud for the obvious reason that what do you mean you can't add to what the Torah tells you to do? Our religion is all adding to what the Torah tells you to do. Everything we do, basically, right? Our tradition is not based so much on the Chumash. I mean, indirectly on the Chumash, maybe. It's based on the rabbinic understanding, the system of behavior, of halacha, that is derived in all kinds of ways from the psukim, in all kinds of ways that strike one as very not what the Chumash seems to be saying at all. And maybe the core text of in terms of our practice, the core text is probably the Mishnah, which is an entire corpus of law, which doesn't explicitly base itself on the verses of the Torah altogether, unlike, say, Medrash Halacha, which does. But the Mishnah of Yehuda Anasi and his students, that's a whole other world, and from there you get the Shulchan Aruch, etc. So what could it possibly mean not to add? The whole thing is added, basically. 95%, 98% of what we do is added. So this is a question that concerned the medieval, certainly. The Rambam talks about it, and there are all kinds of different resolutions, but part of it has to do with the idea of building safeguards around the Torah.
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
it's also in that expression, Lo al taseh et atzmacha l'tzadik kol kach gadol. Like don't try to add the chumras when they're not expected in the law.
I'm not talking about chumras. I'm talking about non-chumras.
Right.
I'm talking about just the plain law. That's a separate question. But I'm talking about the law itself. The law itself, Shulchan Aruch, it's based on the Mishnah, on the Gemara, etc. 98% of our behavior is that. Apart from the separate takanot that were made, but the core idea is the understanding is that when the Torah says not to add, that doesn't mean you can add all kinds of things that sort of are what's called safeguards around the Torah. In order to make sure you don't do X, so you don't do A, B, C, D, E, F, G either, because that would lead you. And in a certain sense, you think about it, in a certain sense, actually, the invoking of Baal Pa'ar, I'm not saying this is the pshat over here, but the mention of Baal Pa'ar, the idolatry of Baal Pa'ar, is a good example of why you need fences around the Torah. Because the fact of the matter is that Israel gets involved in all kinds of idolatry, and there's a terrible destruction there. But it doesn't start with idolatry. It starts with the Moabite and the Midianite women, and gradually they got involved with them. Then they get involved in their practices and in their idolatry. So the very story of Baal Pa'ar itself doesn't start with idolatry. So that actually is a good example of why you need fences around the Torah, and which is what a lot of, if not most of, the rabbinic ordinances, in fact, are. In any event, this is a very big topic, and it's not one that we can deal with in this context, though it's quite interesting. The question is one of the interesting commentaries over here on Lo Tosifu is, in other words, does Lo Tosifu mean there's a certain prohibition or a certain behavior that is, or certainly even a positive mitzvah, but you want to do it. You want to do something additional. there are four batim for the tefillin. You make five. That's in the Talmud. That's a kind of Baal Tosif. But what about if you just make up a new holiday, for example? There's a new holiday. So there's a very famous Ramban here on this pasuk, Lo Tosifu, and the Ramban says, even though it's not mentioned in the Talmud, if somebody would create a new holiday, for example, in Sefer Malachim, Yeravam ben Nevat makes up a new holiday. The 15th day of the month following Sukkot. 1 month after Sukkot, he makes his own holiday. He doesn't want people going to the temple in Jerusalem. He's the king of the north. He wants them going to the temples of the north. So he makes up a new holiday. The Ramban says that's an example of Baal Tosif. So there's an enormous amount of conversation, discussion in the Talmud, the commentaries on the Talmud, and all kinds of discussions about Baal Tosif. That's not our topic. But I do want to say one thing about Baal Tosif that is interesting, and some of the commentaries here make this point as well, which is the prohibition not to add and not to subtract is found in two places, both in Sefer Dvarim. The first place is over here. Lo tosifu v'lo tigru mimenu. The second place, if I can just find that very quickly. The second place is found chapter 13, verse number 1. Chapter 13, verse 1. I'll read it to you.
Chapter 13, verse 1 of what?
Dvarim. Dvarim 13:1. Et kol hadavar asher anochi mitzaveh etchem oto tishmu lasot lo tosef olav v'lo tigra mimenu. And that verse actually, I think, is very instructive for us, because if you look at chapter 13, verse 1, and you go back 2 verses, right? Go back 2 verses. You're going to live in the land. Hishamer lecha. Verse number 30 of the 2 verses earlier. Be careful when you get into the land. Pentinokesh achareihem acharehi shabdami panecha. Ufen tidrosh elohehem lemar. Echa yavdu hagoyim oel elohehem v'yesekein gamani. Otasu kein Hashem Elohecha. You come into the land. This is actually a very interesting question. You're going to come into the land. You're going to see the practices of the nations in the land. And you're going to say, let's see what they're doing. Maybe we should do it as well, right? Now, what does that mean? Maybe we should do it as well. V'yesekein gamani. It's actually ambiguous. Does it mean, oh, they have such a lovely idolatrous service? I'd like to do that service too. Is that what it means? Or does it mean something else? Does it mean they have a lovely, they do lovely things at their service? Maybe we should incorporate what they do into our service. Not that we're going to do idolatry, but they have certain practices for their idolatry. We're going to incorporate their practices into our practice. Now, if that's the meaning of that verse, then actually we understand what Baal Tosif is, lo tosef. In other words, it's not so much we're doing idolatry. No, we're serving God. Or we're going to serve God in ways that the idolaters serve their gods. And maybe that would make sense in terms of lo tosif, lo tigra. In other words, when you read the Chumash, one can make the argument, I think, in the pshat of the Chumash, that lo tosif and lo tigra appears twice in terms of idolatry. It's not a general proposition you can't add and subtract, but rather when it comes to idolatry, which is at the center of Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim, more than any other, by far more than any other book, is about the prohibition of idolatry. And then we have an interesting possibility. And it doesn't just mean you can't worship idols, but you can't use idolatrous practices in your own worship. Now, this raises all kinds of very interesting questions, because, one could make the argument, if they're doing something which is very, very beautiful, why can't we do the same thing in terms of our own practice. So the question is, what practices are in fact totally disallowed, and what practices are in fact they're fine, because we're not doing it for their purposes. We do it for our own purposes. The person I know who was very very adamant that we have to have our own practices, and none of the practices of, say, the church, for example, should ever enter into Jewish worship, was Rabbi Soloveitchik. That was one of his. He was very, 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 very strict about that. And why he was strict about it, and that's a whole other interesting conversation. But I'm not going to get into that now. But in any event, I'm just pointing out that Lo Tosif and Lo Tigra can be read, and some do read it this way, as limited to idolatry. And I point out that in the second instance, one can even understand it to be not just about not worshiping idols, but not doing what they do. That would be not to add to your service. So they have something, or maybe we're going to subtract something because we saw something elsewhere. So that's prohibited. But the mainstream view in the Talmud is not that way. The Talmud has the mainstream view is that Lo Tosit and Lo Tigra refers to particular mitzvot, and of course, the Talmud takes the position, obviously, that you can add a lot of things, provided there's a reason to add them. The main reason being to safeguard the Torah. It says in Pirkei Avot to make a fence around the Torah. That's something you should do. That's one point over here. I want to make another point about these 4 verses. A word that appears in Sefer Dvarim more than once, and something to think about, and that is the fourth pasuk, chapter 4, verse number 4. V'atem advekim Hashem Elohechem chayim kulchem hayom. You who cleave unto God, atem advekim Hashem Elohechem, you are alive today. Moshe recalls the story of Baal Pa'ar. The story of Baal Pa'ar is an interesting story, and you see the last verse of chapter 3, Vaneshev Bagai Mul Beit Pa'ar, because what Baal Pa'ar was idolatry. But Baal Pa'ar was idolatry of the second generation. The idolatry of the first generation is the golden calf. All those people, that generation dies in chapter 20 of Sefer Bamidbar. Baal Pa'ar is chapter 25 of Sefer Bamidbar. So Baal Pa'ar was the ego, kind of the sequel to the golden calf of the second generation. The people Moshe is speaking to, they know people that were involved in Baal Pa'ar. They were all there. And so Moshe mentions Baal Pa'ar. And there the Chumash says, in terms of Baal Pa'ar, it started with the women, this and that. Vayitzamed Yisrael Baal. They became deeply connected to Baal Pa'ar. And Moshe here says the language of V'atem hadvekim Hashem Elohechem chayim kulchem hayom. The idea of being davuk to God. We know the word davuk, davek. V'davak b'yishto v'yu l'vasar echad, beginning of the Torah, right? Men and women cleave to each other, right? They become one. Sefer Devarim, we have a new mitzvah, l'davka bo, dvekus. And we'll talk about that later. But Sefer Devarim has certain basic themes that don't appear elsewhere. This idea of being davuk to God, maybe we'll talk about that as we go through the book. What precisely does that mean? In any event, this is Moshe's introduction. Now, I want to make one other point over here, and I'll stop, take some questions, and we'll continue. And that is, these are the laws and commandments that I teach you, says Moshe, in order that you are able to live in the land. So, in other words, the point is that the bulk of this book will be all kinds of commandments, some of which we are familiar with from before, many of which we are not familiar from before. Even the ones we are familiar, there's always a shift, a change, a different focus, different details. But the purpose of it is in order that you live in the land. And what's interesting is that Sefer Devarim contains all these new laws that Moshe is going to teach the people. And the question is, in the Chumash, when did Moshe himself learn these laws? we'll take up that question maybe next week or in a couple of weeks. How does this work exactly? So Moshe has the Torah says something very interesting about when Moshe himself learned these laws. Just to come back to the first point, this enables you to live in the land. The chukim and mishpatim, the mitzvot, or what entitles you to live in the land. If you behave, you follow God's strictures, you'll stay in the land. And by implication, of course, if you don't, you can be exited. The same way the Canaanites were exited. Chumash is very clear about that. Okay, let me just stop here for a minute before we continue. Are there any comments or questions on anything I've said till now?
Just want to highlight something from chat that Devorah Sondheim said a few minutes ago. The first time the prohibition is in plural and the second time in singular. Is that significant?
Yes, it is significant. And there's a lot of discussion about that. I can't get into that now. That is significant. Yes, true. That's good. That's a good insight too. Yeah, there's a difference between those two. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Sandra?
Yes, Rabbi. So, in Breshit, discussing, I think it was Yehuda and Tamar, and having sons together, the word lo yosif and lo hosif took on a slightly different meaning. In other words, the commentaries and I think even Rashi was trying to say that the lo hosifa od, and she didn't. The question is whether or not lo hosif means to stop the behavior. Right. Or to add to the behavior. So as I'm listening to the shir, I'm thinking to myself, lo tosifu. Is the only reason we're sure that the lo tosifu here is don't add, because the following phrase is velo tigru. So in other words, since it's parallel with lo tigra, then we know that the lo tosif means don't add. But if in fact it didn't have the lo tigra, would we be in the same pickle as they are in Breshit when they say, does it mean they didn't continue to have sexual relations, or they never stopped? In other words, stopping or stopping.
That's a good question. You have it elsewhere in the Chumash. Kol gadol v'lo yosaf sounds like it didn't stop. Lo yosaf.
Yeah.
It continued. It's true. And Yehuda v'Tamar. Personally, I think it means they didn't continue in Yehuda v'Tamar. But here, anyway, as you point out, here it's clearly it means to add, because it has lo tigra, which is to subtract.
Right.
There's a ton of stuff about this
right. But it's interesting that they had to add the lo tigra, that the lo tigra is always partnered with it, because my suspicion is that in the olden understanding of lo tosifu, it could be both depending on the context.
That is possible.
To be very clear, they said no tosifu. Hello, that means you can't add. Awesome.
It's totally possible, right? What it means to subtract is a good question. These are issues that not really Chumash questions so much. These are more interesting. They're very interesting questions. What does it mean to subtract? If you don't do something, you're subtracting? I would say no, you're not subtracting, you're just not doing it. Okay, but anyway, let's leave that for now. That's not our topic, as interesting as it may be. Anybody else for comments? We still have more time. Let's continue. Good. Okay. Now Moshe continues. כאשר ציווני אדוני אלוהי לעשות כן בקרב הארץ, אשר אתם באים שמה לרשתה, ושמרתם ועשיתם, כי היא חוכמתכם ובינתכם לעיני העמים, אשר ישמעון את כל החוקים האלה ויאמרו, רק עם חכם ונבון הגוי הגדול הזה, כי מי גוי גדול, אשר לא אלוהים קרובים אליו, כאדוני אלוהינו, בכל קוראינו אליו, ומי גוי גדול, אשר לא חוקים ומשפטים צדיקים, ככל התורה הזאת, אשר אנוכי נותן לפניכם היום. This is a very interesting section. Moshe says, I have taught you chukim and mishpatim, as God has commanded me. Presumably he refers to what he's taught them already. And he says, those also, what I taught you already is also preparatory to possessing the land and to doing these mitzvot, etc., in the land. And then Moshe says, and be very careful and be very careful about this. I mentioned this, I think, in the very first year. This is a Devarim theme, 100%. Sefer Devarim places a premium upon wisdom. I told you that at the beginning of the book, and Moshe appoints the judges. says, Moshe says, I told you people to find Anoshim Chachamim Unevonim. Find wise people, wise and discerning people. Elsewhere in the Torah, it doesn't say anything about the judges being wise. It talks about the judges being honest, people of integrity, people who fear God, courageous people, Anshe Chayo. When Yitro tells Moshe to choose judges, he doesn't mention wisdom at all. Chachma and Bina are mentioned in the beginning of Sefer Devarim. Here you have it as well. Your commandment says the Torah is a source of wisdom. Chachmatchem ubinatchem li'eineho amin, which I think is very interesting. It's very important that you perform the mitzvot because they are testimony to the wisdom of the Torah and the wisdom of God. And your sounds like our responsibility. Sounds like there's some kind of responsibility to the world and behave in such a way that people will actually respect the people and respect the God because who is closer to God? Right? In other words, the idea that the Torah makes sense. It makes sense that anybody who sees it, I understand, it makes perfect sense. And I mentioned that the Rambam in the guide cites these verses, not surprisingly, when he talks about the various mitzvot. The Rambam has a whole section in the guide explaining the reason behind the mitzvot, Tamei HaMitzvot. Some people, he says, think the mitzvot have no reason. They're simply decrees of God that don't have to make sense. And the Rambam says, if they don't make sense, why would the nation say, what a wise people this is? They might say, what an obedient people this is. But why would they say, what a wise people this is? So therefore, all the mitzvot have to make sense. Sometimes we don't know the reason for all the commandments, but there are certainly reasons, and they certainly make sense. So this is a Sefer Devarim theme. Appears nowhere else, as far as I can tell, that the Torah is a source of wisdom. And I would add, it sounds like there's some kind of directive here to behave in such a way that the nations of the world can recognize that this people is acting in the most moral way, in the most devout way, kind of Kiddush Hashem. And because after all, they see you as being connected to God, and they see the way you behave. So that would be, it's interesting that the Torah mentions the other nations over here. Could have said, do these mitzvot because they're good for you. They make total sense. The Torah is not content with that alone. The Torah says the nations of the world will see it. Okay. And now Moshe continues. Raki shamer lecha ushmar nafshecha miyod. Now we come to a basic theme of Sefer Devarim. Very, very basic theme of Sefer Devarim. And that's the following. Hishamar lecha ushmar nafshecha. The word Hishamar has appeared many times. Be very careful. The word shamar can mean to guard. It can mean to remember. The word lishmar can mean to remember. Shamar et yom HaShabbat l'kadsho in the Ten Commandments means, the pshat means remember to keep the Sabbath holy. The same as zachar. Zachar and shamar, maybe some fine difference between them, but they both mean to remember. Shamar lecha ushmar nafshecha ma'od pen tishkach et hadvarim asher ra'u einecha. Lest you forget what your eyes saw. There's some of you have to remember, and you have to impart it to your children. What must you remember? The day you stood before God in Choreb, which is Sinai. Gather the people, let them hear my word. Asher yumadun v'yiralti, kol hayomim asher imchem ha'adama, yepneihem yu'amedun. So what is this reference of? This is a fundamental theme of Sefer Devarim. The Ramban thinks, actually, the various authorities, many people wrote 613 mitzvot. The Rambam has his 613 mitzvot, with a long introduction, which is longer than the list of mitzvot, and the Ramban has a critique of the Rambam. And one of the critiques, Rambam says some of the mitzvot the Rambam counts shouldn't be counted, and he also left out mitzvot. For example, he left out this mitzvah. There's a mitzvah, says the Ramban, not to forget Matan Torah, to remember the revelation of Sinai. That's a mitzvah. Hishamer lecha, lest you forget. Pentishkach, you can't forget this. We have to remember it and impart it. The experience of Sinai. And what's interesting is what's spoken of over here isn't so much the content of Sinai, but what's spoken over here is standing at Sinai in the presence of God, the revelation,
The
right?
experience.
The experience, the revelation of Sinai, which is Sinai is a covenant, Sinai is a revelation, and Sinai has a content. They're mitzvot. Over here, the main focus seems to be the experience. And what's interesting is that when Moshe talks about the experience of standing at Sinai, it says, when God said, Hakel li et ha'am v'yashmiyem et dvarai. Hakel, gather the people together, and they will hear my words, in order that they learn to fear me. We'll talk about that next time, about fear. Love and fear in the book of Devarim, very central. And later, Moshe refers to this event of Sinai as Yom HaKahal, the day of the gathering of the people. I mention this because at the end of this book, not the very end, but towards the very end of the book, I believe it's chapter 31. Chapter 31, there's a new mitzvah. It's called Hakel. The mitzvah of Hakel is once every 7 years. The people gather together and somebody reads the Torah to them. And the idea of Hakel, it would appear, is very much related to what we have over here. Hakel liyata'am v'yashmiyem et dvarai. In other words, what you have in Sefer Devarim, this event of Sinai is important in and of itself. We can't forget it. But it also is played out in the Torah. It's played out every 7 years. There's a kind of re-acceptance of the Torah. That's the mitzvah of Hakel. And actually, in our practice, this idea of re-experiencing, of reliving the giving of the Torah, we do it all the time. When we read the Torah on Shabbat or the holidays, even during the week, we are in a sense re-experiencing Sinai. In fact, it's interesting to note that the original custom of reading the Torah on Shabbat, they would complete the Torah twice in 7 years. Twice in 7 years. And no doubt that is connected to Hakel. Hakel was once every 7 years. So in Kriyat HaTorah, reading little pieces of the Torah, it was done in the land of Israel twice in 7 years. There's a long article by a fellow named Shlomo Naer who makes this point, and it's a very, very convincing point, so the idea of reading the Torah is to re-experience. We'll talk more about that. But this is something which is basic to Sefer Devarim. Just to repeat this last point. First of all, Sefer Devarim is the book that puts Matan Torah at the center. Receiving the Torah is the central event for Sefer Devarim. I don't think that's true earlier in the Chumash. I think in the Chumash it's more building the Mishkan. The Mishkan is not mentioned at all in Sefer Devarim. There's very little emphasis on the temple, but it's Matan Torah which is at the center, and the need to not forget this experience and also to reenact it periodically is a basic theme of Sefer Devarim. We'll talk more about this as we proceed through the book. So I guess we'll stop at this point. We'll continue next week. We do meet next week, and we'll continue with chapter 4. When we get to chapter 5, hope we get there during this set of classes, but that's when the commandments begin, beginning with the 10 commandments. Okay, we'll stop at this point, I guess, and looking forward to next week. Anybody, any comments or questions for you?
Nothing in chat right now.
Nothing now. Okay, then. Very good. Okay, looking forward to continuing with you. Thank you. Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone. And we will meet next week. There will be more winter classes coming up. I would happily direct you to sign up, but currently our website is experiencing technical difficulties. Take care and see you all another day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.